Hello everyone, my name is Joanne Lockwood and I am your host for the Inclusion Bites podcast. In this series, I have been interviewing a number of amazing people and simply having a conversation around the subject of inclusion, belonging, and generally making the world a better place for everyone to thrive. If you'd like to join me in the future, then please do drop me a line to joe.lockwood@seechangehappen.co.uk. That's SEE changehappen.co.uk. You can catch up with all of the previous shows on iTunes, Spotify, and of course the usual places. So plug in your headphones, grab a decaf, and let's get going. Today is episode 31 with the title, Will Diversity and Inclusion Just Happen? And I have the absolute honour and privilege to be joined by William Buist. William describes himself as someone who works with clients to ensure they have the clear business strategies and goals to make them stronger. When I asked William to describe his superpower, he said that it is curiosity. Hello, William. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Joe, and very good to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Absolute pleasure. I'm pleased we've been talking about this for a couple of months, and I'm pleased we finally made it. So, William, do you think that diversity and inclusion will just happen?
It's such an interesting question, and I think there have been certainly, there's been a lot of legislation over the years to try to help move this along and make sure that we are treating everybody as we should, as equals. And I think the danger is that we kind of think there are certainly some people out there who now think that diversity and inclusion either has already happened or that they don't need to do anything more. And I just think, whilst that's possible, if we were to take that view of just letting things run as they are, change would still happen, but it would happen too slowly. I think too slowly for you, too slowly for me, too slowly for the world at large. We need to take action. I'm a white bloke, so I've had privilege all my life. I've had an unfair advantage, and too often that unfair advantage actually is invisible. I haven't noticed that I've had an advantage because I'm the one with it. I think it's always very easy to see the disadvantage if you are the one that is disadvantaged. And as a result, I've kind of, for a long time, not really realized the impact that privilege has had on other people. And I see today, we've kind of become aware of it as the years have gone by and seen people that I know and love struggling to overcome the disadvantage that the world has thrown at them, and realizing that I wouldn't have had those difficulties. If I want to open a door into a company, if I pick up the phone and dial the number and ask to speak to somebody, I'm more likely to get through than some other people. Because I've got a male voice, because I'm a white bloke, and that just feels intrinsically wrong. But if you are a white bloke, you may not have really noticed that happening because you pick the phone up and you get put through. So, what is there to notice? You've gone to do something and it's happened. It's very difficult to be in the shoes of the people for whom that doesn't happen. And I know I'm using a very simple example, but it's true in so many areas. So do I think it will just happen? No, I don't. I think people like me who've got privilege need to consciously do something to step away from that privilege and level the playing field. And I want to level the playing field by bringing the parts of it that are struggling and finding it harder up, rather than damaging and doing down the good things that are on that playing field. And I think that's a harder thing to do than just to kind of, some of the muted legislation over the years has sought to do. Actively discriminating against a group that's had advantage doesn't necessarily do anything to remove discrimination. What we need to do is think about how do we get into a situation where it doesn't happen at all, where it's not part of the consideration. And that's a different world, not an amendment of the current one. And I think that's hard. I think it's, we all need to be thinking about how do we do that. So Sorry, that's a long answer to a very simple question.
Yeah, no,
But
that's
what do
a
you
very
think,
good
Joe?
answer.
I mean, where do you think we are?
Very good answer. I mean, I've heard a saying that a fish doesn't see the water it swims in until it's taken out of the water. And that's often how privilege works. You don't see your privilege until you're taken out of your privilege, or you suddenly have something that changes your life, that makes you appreciate your privilege. And yeah, that's very true. And the other thing that resonated with what you're saying is that we need to involve everybody in these discussions, and to demonize white men, to demonize people who have privilege and not involve them in conversations doesn't drive change. So it's about collaborative conversations, which is what I believe in. I think the other thing that what you said struck me was that, and I paraphrase what you said, what we need is rapid evolution rather than revolution. So it's not about throwing away everything we've currently got. It's about evolving at a pace of change that is acceptable to everybody whilst maintaining what is working. And I think that would be make people feel more comfortable, because I think there's a danger that by being inclusive and being forward thinking, we leave people behind, and often the people we're leaving behind are the incumbents, and then they feel more marginalized in the same way that I think when we looked at post-apartheid South Africa, then the white community were then marginalized in a different way. So, and I'm not saying I don't understand South African politics, so I'm not making any judgment call there, but what we want to try and do is make sure that there's equity in society for everybody, and suddenly we don't end up displacing people and saying, well, you've had your turn now, it's now our turn. And all that does is create reluctance for change, and people will tend to barricade their castle and say, well, I'm not going to let you in. And I think my stance is always dialogue, collaboration, talking, cooperation, lower the drawbridge, sit round and, in pirate terms, parley, talk about the problems, but not let talking be a preventative of progress. We don't want lots of committees. We don't want lots of dragged out. If we want gender equality, we need to have some really tight timescales. We need to be looking at 2030, and that's not far away. Some might argue that 2030 is a long way away or too far. But we've got to start making change. We've got to start setting something realistic. But yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying.
Yeah. It's you're right. 2030 isn't very far away. It will be here before we know it, in many ways. And I think if we were to get to 2030 and not have a different world where, people were seen for who they are, how they feel, what they think, the thoughts that they have and the value that they bring to the world by what they do and how they behave. And in all of that, I haven't mentioned anything on which we discriminate or create this kind of sense of othering that still exists in society. We see it every day. See people talking about, immigration in ways that is discriminating against primarily colour of skin, but other things as well. Religion can come into that as well. And there's this whole piece around, people like me, and I don't mean people like me, William Buist. I mean, that sense of people like me has a stronger draw than people who are not like me. And that's always going to be true. It's part of the human condition. But that's about difference. It's not about better or worse. And too often it's interpreted as better and worse rather than just different, and not looking for and celebrating those differences and saying, what can this teach us? What is there about somebody who's blind in terms of the way they perceive the world? Because clearly they're not seeing it. They're feeling it, hearing it, tasting it, and touching it. Now, what is it that they get from doing that I don't get because I look at it? And what learning is there in that? And when you have those conversations, boy, do you learn some stuff that's interesting. And that takes me into a little story actually about one of the things that I think as a business person that we all do is, we're talking to the people we know, to our clients, to people who have run across us, and from time to time they ask things like, a question that starts with who do you know who? Who do you know who does a diversity and inclusion podcast, or who do you know who speaks on communication skills? And those questions, they're trying to get to somebody in my mind who I know, who I understand, who I think is good at that thing that they're asking about, and who I would refer. And I remember when I first joined an organisation called the PSA, of which we are both members, the Professional Speaking Association, which some of your listeners I'm sure will be too, but others perhaps haven't heard of it. And one of the things that struck me very quickly was how collaborative that community of people is, and how much referral goes on between speakers of other speakers. For people who are all in the industry of speaking, there is almost no competition because we all speak on our topic, whatever our topic is. So we're not worried about referring others because we're referring them for their topic, not for ours. But one of the things I noticed was that there was a tendency for people, and I think rightly, only to refer those people who they had seen speak and who they knew well. And you look at the history of the speaking industry, and the history of the speaking industry was white blokes. And so what you've got is people who've seen white blokes who are really good at what they do, and so the white blokes refer the white blokes. And it's not that they're trying to exclude anybody, and it's not that they're trying not to be diverse. They're just the people that they've seen and that they know. And so I looked at that and I thought, let me have a look at my black book and see who would I refer. And I started realizing that my black book too was filled with people who were white and male predominantly. And I thought that something should change. And the only person who can change that is me. So I've been spending the last 5 or 6 years deliberately seeking out people from other backgrounds, other diversities, and seeking to be inclusive in who do I know, who's in my black book. And I remember somebody we both know that sadly is no longer with us, Joy Marsden. Joy, wonderful black lady who spoke really about motivation and keeping going when times were tough, and a whole beautiful style that she had. And she was speaking down the road from where I live in Cardiff, and I thought, I haven't seen her speak. I'm going to go and see her speak because then I can put Joy in my black book as one of the people who I would refer. If that's worthwhile doing. And there's two things that happened. One is that Joy was, quite taken aback to find me there in the audience. It wasn't an audience she would expect to see me in, and I explained why I'd come to see her speak. And we struck up a really strong and enduring friendship from having done that. And she taught me an awful lot that helped me with my speaking, which wasn't why I went to see her at all. And part of my point here is that when we are inclusive, we're going to get benefits we didn't even consider when we set out to do those things. And I just would invite listeners to think about, where have you got an inadvertent, unintentional bias in the things that you do and say and think that lead you to a less inclusive group of people than you could otherwise have? And what can you do to change that? Because that's how we change this. That's how we make the world more inclusive. 100 million little changes is much better than one piece of legislation that most people don't understand.
Yeah, I think nudges is a good word as well. We can make a small nudge, inclusive nudge. We can be an ally, whatever. Allyship doesn't have to be huge, massive gestures. As you say, it can be a small nudge. It can be a small invitation. It can be amplifying. It can be creating space for someone to have access to something that they wouldn't have had without your input. And it's interesting what you're talking about networking. I know many people who come from marginalized or underrepresented communities or are underrepresented in certain positions. Networking is often a big barrier because it's generally the domain, and I'm not saying historically it was the domain of the white man or the man in power. You had, in order to go to a breakfast networking event, you had to have availability to go to breakfast somewhere else, where many working women, and there are many working parents who aren't women as well, but there are many working women who had responsibilities for childcare, found it very difficult to do both jobs, go networking at breakfast and make the children okay and sort out the home, etc., etc. And then another networking zone is lunch hour, and then there's after work networking. And again, there's often discriminated against women who had home and family responsibilities. And as we both know, it's quite difficult sometimes to break into the networking clique. You've got to have a level of confidence. Maybe you need to be referred in by somebody. So if you haven't got access to that power and privilege circle, how do you make your first break? How do you get someone to give you that leg in? And as you were saying, the important thing here is just creating that little bit of movement, identifying someone's on the outside, and just opening the door and say, come in, meet my friends. This is so-and-so. They're fantastic. They do this. And I've used them before and they're amazing. And that's what networking's about. We just got to make sure we're doing it to people who are not the traditional people. I've seen people who go networking and go, and you end up evaluating whether someone's suitable for the club. They all sit around and discuss about this person and say, well, actually, they're not really very businessy. They're a bit kind of bit working class for us, really. We're a bit more business professional. And I've seen people actually creating judgments on whether someone's good enough to join the networking club because of their social standing. And that was less than 5 or 6 years ago. And I think, we must be still doing that. It must be still happening, because I can't believe the society's changed that much. But we are. We're furthering these, as you call it, othering, which is a great term. We're seeing people who are different to us as other, the outsider, and they're still doing so. How I don't know how much networking you do outside the PSA, but it still happens on LinkedIn. Maybe we're amplifying different people, maybe people like us.
Yeah, and I think there's a real challenge around understanding who the people in the group are from the outside as well. That as well as you've rightly described, that whole ethos in a networking group of, are they good enough? And I mean, who defines what good is, for goodness sake? I mean, it's a nonsense, isn't it? And it's one of the things I think that, we're recording this at the beginning of March 2021. So, we're in a lockdown situation at the moment in the country. We're almost a year into the pandemic and having to work much more frequently remotely. You and I were just chatting before we started recording about how that's affected our business and our ability to reach out to people and to get our businesses in a wider, with wider acceptance. I don't know about you, but I've certainly been chatting to people all over the world in a way that I simply would not have done had I been traveling, because, I wouldn't chat to somebody in Australia for half an hour and fly out there to do that. It's just not feasible. It was always feasible before, but it tended not to happen. And now we've got this opportunity to network in a very different way. And I think I'm delighted, because I've seen people on those networking calls and events and things who you wouldn't necessarily normally see, because they're in a wheelchair, or they're blind, or they've got some other disability that means it's difficult for them to travel or to get out or to go, as you say, at breakfast time or in the evening when other pressures come to bear. And that opportunity to have time spent with people for whom you wouldn't normally spend time has just reinforced, again, to most of the people that I know, and especially to me, that people are just people. They're just, it doesn't matter whether the body's working properly or not. If you've got some physical disability or what the color of your skin is or what religion you are, we're all human. We all feel, we all think, and we all have the opportunity to listen and process in our own way from our own experience and play back, as you did earlier in this podcast. You listened to what I said and you paraphrased it and you played it back. And then I'm hearing that paraphrase. What I'm hearing is what you heard, tempered with your experience, all the years of experience that you've had. And how valuable is it to get that feedback? Have I been clear in my communication? I can only tell when I hear it played back to me. And what I'm delighted to see is that people are kind of having their eyes opened a bit to the fact that everybody can bring value, regardless of their history, regardless of their social standing, regardless of anything. If they're in a conversation and they're bringing to bear their viewpoint, it has as much value as anybody else. And the more we can show that and demonstrate it, the more we break down that fear of the other that we've been talking about. And it's a fear. It's not based on anything systematic other than an emotion. And the way we break down fear is to build familiarity and comfort and trust. And I think that's something that this medium, the in lockdown medium of communicating across technology, has really helped to do. And I just hope that hangs around when we move back into a more open society where we can meet in person as well. And I kind of, a challenge for those who are listening is, how are you going to be as inclusive as you have been on Zoom and all those other tools when you're back into traveling and meeting people? What are you going to do differently because of what you've learned in the last year to be more inclusive? And I think if we all think about that question a little bit, well, that might make quite a difference.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about the listening element here. And I mean, we're speakers. We like to share stories. We like to share our own story. And we like to listen to other stories. But one of the things I always focus on is, as a human species, we tend to be, most of our conversations around trying to sell our own ideas. We always want to say we're right. We want to give our perspective and educate somebody. And we do that all the time, not just in professional, but when we're trying to decide which cinema film we're going to go and watch. We want to persuade the other person we're going with. We want to watch our film or their film. We're trying to come to consensus. And what I encourage people to do in a D&I space, or even in a humanity space, is to start trying to prove yourself wrong all the time, which may sound like an oxymoron, or may sound a bit crazy, but if we try and prove ourselves wrong, we'll get to the truth quicker. Because otherwise what we end up doing is entrenching in our positions, trying to prove ourselves right. Whereas if I start asking you questions about your reality, about your perception, I'm going to learn about you and why you think something. So we're not actually having a debate about the minutiae of the point we're trying to make. We're trying to understand the logic or the person behind the point they're trying to make. Because we may not agree on the point, but I may be able to understand that your lived experience, where you've been in life, the things that have affected you have led you to think this is a good idea. And I go, well, I don't see it as a good idea because I've had this. And when we start to understand who we are, we start to forget about the point of right or wrong. We just go, actually, I understand about William now. And I kind of realize where you're coming from, or why you've said that. And we're not agreeing to disagree. We're just agreeing to understand each other's perspectives on why something is different between us. I think, and that's the challenge of trying to prove yourself wrong rather than always trying to prove yourself right. Because otherwise we just end up in these entrenched, unwinnable arguments where nobody comes out enlightened or with any more knowledge than they started with. And that's because by opening our mind, I can come up with another opinion without having to agree with you. Show me your workings out. We may have a different answer, but I get your workings out. I can see where we differ. And that's I think the power of listening and reflecting and understanding somebody, just to learn about someone else's perspective. And I think that's the power of, when we talk about diversity, we talk about inclusion, it's about the power of other people. It's about those powers of other perspectives, those powers of difference of opinions, someone from a different ethnicity, a different faith, a different background, a different gender, whatever the gender identity is. That person has a different perspective on life to me. And I want to learn about that perspective so I can incorporate that into my model and go, okay, I know what it's like to be me, but I don't know what it's like to be you. So let me hear your story. And the next time I meet someone who's different from me, I'll go, okay, I've heard lots of stories. I kind of get different perspectives now. And I can then be involved in their conversation because I've got that sort of way of thinking in my head. And I think that's the kind of the key thing. But picking up on the other thing you were talking about is the othering, the disability. I watched on iPlayer the other night a documentary called Silenced, and it was about disability, people of disability, and it was looking at the history of that, about the eugenics, about how we were trying to fix people, how people who had deformed limbs had to be put in casts, and how there was this fear of people who were missing limbs and they had to wear prosthetics. It wasn't for their benefit, it's so they didn't scare the other people. So we've kind of built up this disfigurement is scary, difference is scary, difference is other. We want to be pure. We want to be a pure tribe for the survival of the species, this Darwinistic type evolution that we're all hanging on about. And when that turns into eugenics, that turns into sort of trying to fix people. Or if we get the technology to understand how someone's going to be born and they're not born healthy enough, good enough, with the right eye color, with the right hair color, with the right number of limbs, do we make that human decision to decide their life isn't worth living with blue hair, green hair, with pink hair, with red hair? And we say, no, unless they've got brown hair, they're not good enough. Or no hair, they're not good enough for the species. And I think that's where it becomes, to say someone who is different has a different quality of life. Because you can't speak English, because you have no wealth, or you have no status, it means you have got a lesser life. And I think the other point you made was people all think the same. You know, we've all got our brains, we all perceive the world, we all see colour and smell and sight, or whatever our abilities are. And we sometimes judge people as being different to us. Well, they can't perceive the world as I do because I'm right. They're wrong. I think this is the danger. And Silence, if you haven't watched it, dig it out on iPlayer. It's an hour of documentary, and I was completely drawn into the stories, drawn into the horror, if you like, of the workhouses, how people have spent 80 years of their life because they were seen as mentally infirm, whatever that meant. They were difficult to deal with. You know, today that would be ADHD. Today that might be someone who was neurodiverse, whatever that may be. These people spent 80 years in the workhouse because they had no exit. No one advocated. No one said, hang on a minute. Once you were in, you were kind of in. And it's frightening. And that was less than 100 years ago.
Well, you know, I'm 62, and you know, in those 62 years, I've seen an enormous amount of change, and yet some things haven't really changed at all. They've changed kind of. There's a veneer of change that's been put over the top. You know, we have equal pay legislation, and have had it for a long time between men and women, and yet still, if you by almost every standard, if you look at the statistics, whichever way you want to look at them, there is still a gender difference in pay, and you know something isn't quite right. There's always reasons. So you know when you start talking to people about why that is, you will always get the defenders who will say, well, you know, that maybe the people who are in different types of jobs are skewed by gender, and it's not the pay that's the issue, it's the fact that you know some women are doing these sorts of jobs and some men are doing those sorts of jobs, and yet still there is clearly something not right in the state of Denmark, as Shakespeare might have said. And you know, I think we need to start looking at these problems, and they are problems, from a different viewpoint. It's not what do we need to do to fix the world as it is? It's what world do we want to build? You know, let's not have legislation to deal with abuses of a system that already exists, because you need to do that. But what world do we want to build for tomorrow? And I remember I was talking to somebody who was quite a senior, I mean, white bloke, of course, quite a senior guy in a big infrastructure national project. And one of the things that he was very, very keen to do was to make sure that he had a really diverse workforce, and he was employing, you know, tens of thousands of people, and he was struggling to get, you know, certain areas of the business filled with what he viewed as, you know, the right level of diversity and inclusion within it. And I absolutely know that his motives were entirely right, and we spent some time talking about the whole recruitment process and what were the processes he was going through. And in the course of that conversation, we kind of identified a whole host of things that were unconsciously biased towards a certain type of employee, and that certain type of employee was not diverse, wasn't inclusive, and that's why they were struggling to make it a diverse and inclusive workforce. And by way of one example, and it is one of many things that we uncovered in the course of some time looking at the whole process end to end, one of the things that they used as a measure of should you apply was experience. And how many job roles do you see that require 2 years, 5 years, 10 years experience? And if you're looking for very senior people, it might be 20 years of experience. So if you're applying to go onto the board of a company and they want 20 years of experience at board level, you've got to have been able to get onto a board 20 years ago. Well, guess what? All the boards 20 years ago were white men. So who's going to get those roles that need 20 years of experience today? White men. And so you not only do you have the issue that you're not resolving, but you're perpetuating it by just not quite thinking through what does this requirement for hiring actually mean we get in terms of people in the pool that's available to be hired. And when we talked about this, I said, well, what's the experience a proxy for? What are you trying to uncover by asking for experience? And, then you dig under the skin of that, and it's about good decision making. It's about inquisitiveness. It's about leadership. It's about, a whole host of skills that if you have had all that experience, you will have honed. But when you start looking at the skills, some of them need, are kind of innate skills. You either have them or you don't. Others of them are things that can be taught and taught very quickly, in which case, if you haven't got them, it doesn't actually matter because you can teach them very quickly and you can overcome that issue. And others of them are not about length of service, but about examples of doing it. So, good decision making. Tell me a couple of really good decisions you've made in the last few years. Right? I don't have to know that you've had lots of experience in decision making. I need to know you know what a good decision is and how you're defining, how you measure a good decision, those kinds of things. So, in this example, they went away and they took apart the whole recruitment process and started looking at, okay, let's not ask for things that are going to favor inadvertently the typical person that would be in those roles. Let's instead, change them and look at what are we actually seeking to achieve. And it didn't solve the problem entirely. I don't think you can solve it in a single change. But you certainly started to get more people who were of, in a more diverse and inclusive way. And of course, once that momentum had started, it built on itself. The fear started going away. The othering started going away because now there were disabled people, and it wasn't a problem. All the things that people say, well, we haven't got enough disabled loos. If we have all these disabled people, where are they going to go to the loo? It's all a nonsense because you just deal with it. And what you get is the talent, and to me, that's the important thing. Anything that isn't about talent that is a problem is solvable. And who solves it? The people with the talent. So get the people with the talent and the problems go away anyway. So, that's another lot.
But that's quite a mindset leap for a lot of companies. It's quite a mindset leap for a lot of companies, though, isn't it?
Massive.
Companies got to have a mindset leap there where they still have this mentality that, as you say, they're looking for 20 years experience. They're looking for this. They've got this round hole and they want a round peg. And anyone who's not quite, they may be round, but they're too small. That they're not prepared to work with them, to train them, to nurture them into that position, or they're too big for the hole. You're too old. You've got too much experience. How often do we hear that? You're over 50. We want someone younger than you who can fit. Ageism, sexism, racism, whatever it may be. We're masking this desire for hitting the ground running. We want someone to hit the ground running, which is code for we want someone like us, someone like the person who was there before, someone like the rest of the team. And it takes a leap of faith because it shouldn't do, because people often see a diversity hiring strategy as meaning hiring for second best. Because if we were hiring for best, we'd be hiring people like we've got already. And I want to get people to start to reframe diversity hiring to hiring people who are marginalised, hiring people who are underrepresented, who isn't represented in our organisation. We want more representation of people of colour, people of different faiths, different genders, different abilities, because we want to have those voices, because that's who our customers are. We've got to be representative of the people we serve. We serve customers. We serve our stakeholders, whoever that may be. And it's no different to the disconnect people feel when the government, the parliament, is made up of people who are different to them. We see the north-south divide, where the people from the north believe that the government in Westminster isn't representative of people with northern voices seeing their challenges. We see it where there's underrepresentation of women in government, where women don't believe that the government is representing them. We see it with people who are black or other ethnic backgrounds saying the parliament is made up of too many white people. They don't hear our voice. So that's no different to us as an organisation. We have to be representative so our customers believe that we're meeting their needs. Our stakeholders, our investors believe that we're meeting our needs. And now we've got to factor in not only diversity and inclusion, but environmental sustainability goals, our Earth footprint, if you like. We've got to try and make sure that we have these ethics that cross from people to planet. And that's how organizations are going to be judged in the future. And I know you work with businesses and you coach, you mentor businesses, you go from, help them go from strength to strength. Do you see this as something that businesses are starting to adopt? Is this an open door, or is this still something you're having to persuade them?
Is it an open door? There's a question. I think it's an unlocked door, not necessarily open. So I think businesses, if they choose to walk through it, are not going to be impeded. They've just got to, press the door handle and carry on through. But if they're looking at it from afar, it kind of looks like it's a locked door, and it's too difficult. I'm probably stretching that analogy too far now myself, but you take my point. And I think I keep coming back to the way that I see change happen is when people are exposed to the advantages of having done it without having necessarily to take that step themselves first. So, because then they want to take the step because it's in their interest to do so. I remember talking to somebody, it's not that long ago, but it was probably pre-COVID. So when we were all meeting in a room and the debate had started about, as long as it's on merit. So, if you're choosing a person for a job or for a speaker to speak on the stage, as long as it's on merit, it's okay. And I don't think that that's enough, as we've discussed. I think that the trouble with merit is it's measured by things that are intrinsically biased. It's not until you see people, I'm going to use a speaking example again, but, people in wheelchairs on stage talking about the reason they were in a wheelchair or who've lost a limb or whatever it is. And you hear these fabulous stories that help you to look at your own life as a, physically able-bodied, fit, healthy, white male. I haven't, and hopefully never do, touching wood now, over to the side, never had an injury that has caused that for me. But what I do know is that if I did have an injury like that I would be on a great adventure. I would learn an enormous amount in a relatively short space of time. And that there's nothing to fear from that. There is opportunity in it. And I know that because I've seen enough people who have had the misfortune to have those sorts of injuries talk about it, to know that, I don't wish it on anybody, but if something happens to me that affects my life in what others outside would see as a negative way, what I would see as the opportunity to learn. And that's a mindset thing. We come back to mindset. It is, all of this is about seeing culture, our culture, whatever that means. Our culture is, the way we do things around here. So if the way that a business does things is not inclusive and not diverse, then that's the way they do it. And you've got to change the culture, and that means changing the hearts and minds of the people within the organisation. in order for that change to take effect and to stick. And there's another key point, isn't it? It's not just about making the change; it's about making the change stick. And it's too easy to go backwards, and people do that. What's the word the Americans use? Recidivists. I love that word because it just rolls off the tongue nicely. The criminals who repeat offend are recidivists, and it's that same kind of thing that people will make an effort to be more inclusive, almost while they feel they're being watched. And then as soon as they're not being watched anymore, they slide back into the old biases. Well, we need to change that view too. And the way we do that, I think, is by really letting people see how much more they can achieve with a more diverse, more inclusive audience, if you're a speaker, with a more diverse, more inclusive workforce, if you're an employer, with a more diverse, more inclusive customer base, if you're a business. How do we appeal across the whole spectrum of humanity? Solve that problem, well, the rest is easy, isn't it?
Is it the fear of getting it wrong, the not knowing where to start, or the enormity of the task? What do you think is the biggest barrier?
I think there's a bit of both of those, not knowing where to start and it being a big challenge. And I've certainly, I organise events from time to time in my business, and one of the things that if you're being diverse and inclusive in organising events, you have to think about is, how do I make sure this event is inclusive? So, is there wheelchair access to the venue? Because we haven't had that issue for a year. And that's why I think we've seen a more diverse audience on Zoom calls and the ability of people who would quite often struggle to get to a third floor meeting room in a building that only has stairs. And so we have to start thinking about all those things that we need to think about in order to be more inclusive. And that's hard because suddenly you find some of the things that you're doing actually do have an unconscious bias against them. And it's nobody's fault that an office block built in the 1950s didn't put lifts in, because those weren't the building regulations at the time. And we've changed the regulations, and now a modern office block will be built with sufficient facilities to cater for most things. Still don't cater for everything. Don't think because you're in a modern building that is inclusive in its design that it caters for every possibility. It doesn't. So you still got to think about it. But then you say, okay, so if we were going to be more inclusive in our employment, now we have the first time or the first few times we do that, you have a real situation of a very much of them and us. There's the 2 or 3 people we've just employed to tick that box, and God help you if that's what you're doing. It's the wrong reason to do it, but some people still do. And you've got that little group, and you've got the big group of all the people who have still got the culture of this is the way we do it around here. And that doesn't include those people. And I've seen that happen. I've seen people being, isolated in an organization because they're different. And they've been employed to address the difference, but they're still isolated by their work colleagues. So you've got to have a real mindset that is about not just how do we do this in recruitment, how do we make the whole office change its attitude, everybody? And that's a big task. It's difficult. It's something you have to put heart and mind and soul and money to, because you've got to invest in the training and the development of people and possibly address the infrastructure issues and so on. And that's only going to happen if you really, really believe in the outcome. So it's too big. It's too hard. It's going to take too long. All things I've heard. None of which I accept as a valid reason.
The other thing that I think it's important to point out to people who are listening to this that just because we've gone online, or our events are online, it solves every person with disabilities problems. And we just introduced new problems, and accessibility around online events is also a major problem. people I know many people who are wheelchair users, but they also have very limited dexterity in their hands and fingers, so they can't contribute in chat, they can't take part in live polls in a speed quick enough to interact in time. I know people who lip read, and sometimes they find online events very, very difficult to lip read. The images are too small. There's too much blur, and not everybody subtitles, not everybody transcribes. Again, it's very difficult. And I know with this podcast, this podcast is not really accessible for people who can't hear, because it's a podcast, it's an audio medium. I don't transcribe it. I don't maintain it's a video experience. It's only an audio experience. But yeah, I'm very conscious. I'm excluding 6 to 10% of the organisation, of the population who are born deaf, or whatever that is, plus the 60% of us who will be deaf at some point or lose our hearing over the course of our lifetimes. So yeah, we've got to think about being inclusive by design, virtually as well as physically, and making assumptions that people with a disability have more access and it's easier for them now. Everything's online. It's not thinking about the individual. It's being very stereotypical or very, very generalistic about our inclusion, saying, well, they should be better off now, and then excluding a whole different set of people. So, yeah, it's a challenge. In large auditoriums, theatres, there were hearing loops. There were other methods to help people who had hearing difficulties access the topic and the conversation. There were screen readers, people who had a sight impairment, got copies of the slides in advance, and they had them transcribed, or they had them read out to them using a transcription service. So again, a lot of these online events aren't doing that. That's another barrier to inclusion that we've got to start thinking about. And as the hybrid world evolves, we've got to think about who are we excluding still, and how can we make them feel more included? And that's the continual process. I mean, we said at the beginning that we can't solve inclusion and diversity overnight. We're not going to. It's getting better, but it's not there yet. We are on an infinite journey. We've still got an infinite way to go. It's always going to evolve, always going to change, and we've always got new things happening. So yeah, I think what you're saying there, it rings true and it resonates a lot. And I love the way you talk about, from your own narrative, your own thinking about the challenge of inclusion, and they resonate so greatly with the way I think and the way I talk as well. So I'm trying to prove myself wrong, as I said earlier. Trying to prove myself wrong, but I keep hearing what I'm thinking, which is in a way it's validating for both of us, I guess. But yeah, it's nice to get into the weeds sometimes. Do you feel as a white bloke that you're under attack by the D&I community? Do you feel that you're seen as not woke enough anymore?
Oh, it's such a good question, because certainly I hear that kind of sentiment, from time to time. No, I don't, not at all. If anything, quite the reverse. I think I think under attack is such it's an interesting thought. No, not in the slightest. And I think, I think I have a responsibility, but I think we all have the same responsibility. It's just that not everybody accepts it, I suspect. And this comes back to something I was saying earlier about this, this discussion about, as long as everything is done on merit, we'll all be fine. And I just think that comment comes from a mindset that I think does feel under attack. It's a kind of siege mentality that takes people to that kind of view of, as long as I'm okay because everything's on merit and I'm good, I don't mind what you do for others. And that's, it's an inward facing sensation. And my view is, unless there is literally nobody in the world who's better, that's the time you should hire me. It's when you've decided there's nobody in the world who's better. It's almost the exact opposite. I don't want to be picked because I certainly don't want to be picked because I'm white and male, right? So that's a given. But I don't want to be picked because I'm good enough either. I want to be picked because I'm the right person for the job. And that's I'm carefully choosing my words here. The right person doesn't mean the best person necessarily. There are times to take people on because of what they will learn, not because of what they bring you. There are times to take people onto, and I'm not talking about employment necessarily, but, onto a project, onto a stage, take people on to the next level of their lives. One of the things I talk about is, when I do speak from a stage, is about mastery and about the journey we're all taking in our lives to get better and better. And, we kind of start out with no knowledge as a child. We learn through rote learning. We learn to talk. We learn to name things. We learn to write. We learn to understand some basics of chemistry and physics and English and maths and all of those things that we learn at school. And we're explorers. We're gathering knowledge. And then we maybe go to university or we go on a training course or we get a job. We're novices at it. And the novices are desperate for experience. They're out trying things to learn, to get experience. They become practitioners. They get good at what they do. And the world lives on practitioners. Almost every job is about having the right person who is able to do that job well, be a practitioner. You do it for a while, you learn stuff, you become expert in it, you learn nuance and subtlety. And that's, again, it's a different sort of learning. So we've had, learning like a child, rote learning. We've got experiential learning. Now we're learning subtlety and nuance. It's kind of honing skills. It's both a mental and a physical learning. But there's a step further, which is that step to mastery. And mastery is much less about doing and much more about being. It's when you stop worrying about taking a good photograph and start thinking about being a photographer. And that difference is about learning to let go, learning to understand that what you do isn't as important as how you do it, as to who you are, how you think. It's all about mindset, and it's all about being inclusive, and it's all about lifting people so that they can learn from all the things that you've learned from. We know those. You know those people when you run into them. They're few and far between, but boy, do they stand out. And they stand out because they're no longer the one that matters. They're there to support everybody else. Back when we were hunter-gatherers, they would have been the elder sitting in the tent who would say, it's time to move the camp because the buffalo will walk next week. And they just knew. I didn't go and catch the buffalo. That was for the younger ones who were still getting the experience of how do you hunt. But they knew where to be. And I think that's the journey that humanity is on with diversity and inclusion. And we maybe got to being practitioners right now. And we need to develop the expertise. But ultimately, as society as a whole, we almost need to completely let go of the idea of needing to be diverse and inclusive, because we will have become diverse and included. We started this call with the question, is it possible that diversity and inclusion will just happen? Well, not until we are more mature as a race, as a species, and not until we've taken the time, effort, and energy to learn the subtleties and nuances and the value of doing that. Then we get there. But it's a long road. You described it as an infinite road, and I don't think it's infinite, but it is long. And we can enjoy the journey while we journey on it too. And I think, that's why I don't feel under siege or under threat, to come back to your question. I don't feel threatened by any of this because I'm enjoying the journey. And I'm, watching and listening and learning and improving what I do and what I think so that I can be a better person as a result of that learning. And that journey is worth taking.
Some might say to enjoy the journey is a privilege. Some might say that to achieve mastery is a privilege. And there are many people who would welcome that privilege and that opportunity. So I think let's not to deny what you've achieved and what you're achieving or whatever everyone else is achieving. But the privilege we hold is the fact that we can do that, and that's aspirational for us. I think what you're saying really is making sure that we create opportunity for people. We look at, we unpick the meritocracy, we unpick what that's truly saying, and seeking to amplify and give opportunity for people who wouldn't have had that opportunity. And that's our pathway, if you like, to giving people the ability to develop and grow and enhance, so that we're not looking for 20 years experience. We're giving people a pathway to mastery from whatever your background is. And that's the mission, if you like, for people with privilege. It's not only about fair pay, as you say, employing people with a disability. It's allowing those people to thrive in a way that they can achieve their potential, which we all hope is the mastery. It's the being fantastic practitioners, being artisans in their craft, whatever that may be. And that's what I believe we can do as a privileged people in society, is make sure that we use that privilege to amplify and give opportunity to others. And I think that's a fantastic sentiment you're saying there. I think that's it's not idealistic. It's not utopian. It's a statement of direction. It's a direction of travel. This is where we're heading, and we can debate whether it's a long journey or an infinite journey as society evolves on a daily basis. But you're right. We've got to keep focused on it. We've got to keep putting petrol in the tank, putting air in the tires, and keeping on that path. Because if we stop and pull over, our progress will be lost as well. So, no, very, very impactful. I really enjoyed listening to you and hearing your thoughts. It's been very powerful. How can people get hold of you? I mean, you speak, you mentor, you train. Have you got a website? Have you got a book? How do people get hold of you?
So, yeah, well, thank you. The website, unfortunately, I have this unusual name, which is one of the real advantages of my parentage. I thank them immensely for that. If that was the only thing they gave me, it would be great. They, of course, gave me other things too. But yeah, William Buist, Buist, williambuist.com is the website, and william@williambuist.com will get you on email to me. I'm very happy to speak to anybody about any of the topics that we've talked about today. But if you're running a business and thinking about how do we address the sorts of issues that we've talked about today, how do we do that from a strategic viewpoint and embed it in the business and make it long lasting, then I'd love to have a chat with you and talk about how to approach that and make it work for you from the beginning and ever better as time goes by.
Fantastic. I've just clicked on the link on your website, gone there, and it's a great website, very easy to navigate. So yeah, I would encourage anyone who's keen to get hold of you, check you out. It's very, very powerful. Well, it's been an amazing journey this last hour. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and obviously a huge thank you to you, the listener, for tuning in and listening in, keeping up to the end. Please do subscribe to keep updated on future episodes of the Inclusion Bites podcast. That's BITES. Tell your friends, I'm sure you have some, and obviously your colleagues. I have a number of exciting guests lined up that I'm sure you'll be inspired by over the next few weeks and months. And we've had an excellent guest today with William. And if you'd like to be a guest yourself, please let me know. I welcome any suggestions and feedback you may have to joe.lockwood@teachandchaplain.co.uk. Tell me about what you'd like to hear on future shows. Tell me how I can improve. In fact, tell me you're listening. Tell me you're out there. Please do. Drop in on LinkedIn. Say hi. So my name is Joanne Lockwood. It's been an absolute pleasure to host this podcast for you today. Catch you next time. Bye.